Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really wonderful to be back here now, my second time at Caltech. I'm really jealous when I come to this campus, and it's so beautiful. A little warm this time, but overall, such a great experience to be here. So thank you so much for having me back. Today, given some conversations about sort of the backgrounds of folks that are here in the course, I tried to, Domeick and I tried to simplify this a little bit to focus just on transformers, so we won't really be going into autoencoders. We'll really just be focused on transformers. I'll try to give you more background. For some folks, this might be a little too kind of entry level. I get it, and happy to kind of talk about kind of more advanced things as helpful. But I just want to make sure we can kind of walk everybody through. And so, before I kind of start on the slides, I definitely just want to thank Domeick. You'll all see he's prepared a really excellent sort of tutorial code notebook to kind of help everybody walk through and gain intuition for what transformers do. So, all right. I'll just take a second to tell you a little bit about my lab and the work we do. So we sort of sit at the intersection of systems neuroscience and neural engineering, where we work on machine learning models to try to understand and interpret neural population activity, typically recorded via electrophysiology through multi-electrode arrays. And then we also develop brain-machine interfaces with the goal of helping people with paralysis. So we're part of the multi-site BrainGate consortium. That's Massachusetts General Hospital, Stanford, Emory, and University of California, Davis. Okay, so what we'll be talking about today, I'm going to try to give people a little bit more motivation and history of machine learning models that are used on sequence data. And then we'll go over the transformer architecture at a very high level. And then I understand there's probably a fair number of imaging people here, so we thought a relevant example might be some recent applications of the transformer to imaging data and language. Then we'll take a very brief break. We'll go through the specific part of the transformer called the transformer encoder. And then we're going to dive into the notebook, and the goal today is that everybody should be able to code up a very basic instantiation of the transformer encoder. So hopefully it'll be fun. Now I'll just note, when I started my lab about 6 years ago, I didn't know anything about transformers, and so like most things in the lab, I kind of get drug in by the trainees in the lab, sort of kicking and screaming. But when they show me the power of something like this, I'm like, well, okay, you're right, let's do it. So I'm not an expert in transformers, but we've done some work that I'm pretty proud of. And I'm definitely not an expert in language or imaging, okay? So there are gonna be some times here where I sound a little dumb, and I might be wrong. But give me some leeway and we'll work with it. Feel free to interrupt and ask questions at any time. But the goal here is to hopefully get people motivated to understand transformers a little bit, okay? All right, so this is a very, the field of natural language processing has a really rich history, cannot possibly summarize it in one slide, but let's just talk about, so I should mention, we're gonna kind of switch back and forth. We're gonna talk about machine learning for a little while, then we'll talk about neuroscience applications, then we'll go back to machine learning, and then go back to neuroscience applications. So hang in there through the machine learning, because it's really important for understanding kind of the neuroscience applications. Okay, so natural language processing, traditional models in natural language processing were sort of handcrafted rules where people would try to, kind of make guesses about the structure of language and write rules. In the 90s is really kind of when really data-driven approaches started to become pretty popular and widespread. So things like what are called bag of words models start to become popular. And then in parallel, in the 1980s, recurrent neural networks are a type of neural network architecture I think you guys have gone over a little bit in this course. And those started to be, it started to be understood that those could be used to model data that has temporal structure, so sequential data. In 1997, specific variant of the recurrent neural network called the long short-term memory network, LSTM, is introduced, and that solved a lot of problems that people were having with RNNs. So it allowed people to start to apply them a little bit more broadly to longer sequences, to more complex and richer data sets. So that's all good. And I'll say, like, my background is a lot more, I've spent a lot more time with RNNs. But then, so RNNs start being applied in natural language processing in the 2010s. So neural natural language processing, RNNs, and I think also some convolutional networks began being applied. And then, this period since 2014 has been really interesting. There's just been kind of an explosion, and hopefully, everybody's seeing the effects of that now in our everyday lives, from text prediction on your cell phones to ChatGPT and all the amazing sort of applications in this space. So you've seen just how this entire field has kind of blossomed, and a lot of that is due to the transformer architecture that we're going to talk about today. Okay, so around up to like 2014 to 2017, there were these models called sequence-to-sequence models, which I'll talk about a little bit, and those were predominantly RNN, recurrent neural network driven. And then in the last couple years, transformers have exploded, dominating this field, and everything that we're seeing these days is a result of that kind of explosion. Yeah, please.
This timeline you could almost put on a logarithmic scale.
Right.
Do you think that is, I guess, maybe suffering from the same problem that maybe early RNNs were, where we have this kind of recency effect? Or is this, like, in 30 years, will we have this same kind of timeline?
That's interesting. You mean some of these things will still be considered relevant, or will they be supplanted?
1997, 2010, 2014, 2017, 2018,
Right.
2023, 2025, the robots take over.
Yeah, well, and then they'll start being in different units of time, I'm sure, so it doesn't really matter. I think every time somebody in machine learning says, like, this is it, we've got it, and we're gonna keep going with this architecture, something else comes around, like, within a year to supplant that. I mean, I think there are already cases where transformers are actually kind of outperformed for really long sequences with something called state space models. So it's a little surprising. I think people were a little surprised by that. But the transformer does.
The same kind of things were maybe happening in the 50s?
I don't know the history well enough to know, but I'm sure there are other folks that would have much better responses to that. Sorry.
My only sense is that in that time, language was being studied as the uniquely human thing.
Right.
And this was why it was such a, like, chalice.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now it's parts of cognition we might no longer be able to consider them uniquely human given the performance of these large language models, right? It's pretty interesting. All right, so let's take an example, so language modeling, let's make that a little bit concrete, okay? So what's the type of problem in natural language processing? Might be neural machine translation, okay? So this is the idea of building a system that can translate from one language to another, okay? So I'm going to butcher this. My French is horrible. But let's imagine you're doing an English to French translation, and your input is, I am happy. And so you want your model to output, je suis content. So how would that work? So I mentioned that there were sequence-to-sequence models that were largely built around recurrent neural networks. And hopefully you have some familiarity now with recurrent neural networks. But the way that would work before, you'd have a pair of recurrent neural networks, okay? One called an encoder, and one called a decoder, okay? The encoder's job is to take in kind of the input language, so the English language, let's say, and it takes it in word by word, okay? So the encoder, this blue box here, its first input is I, okay? Then it has some internal state that it updates. Then it gets the next input, am, right? And then it has some memory of I, and then it's taking in this am and updating its internal state. Then continues on, happy, right? And then you have tokens like end of sentence, EOS, okay? So that's like, there's not going to be any more English input coming in. And then the RNN updates its internal state. And then it needs to take that information and pass it on to a second neural network, okay, a decoder neural network. And now that decoder neural network takes kind of the state of the encoder RNN, kind of the representation that it's produced, and is now going to try to produce the French version of that sentence. So you say, okay, beginning of sentence, you push that into the decoder network, and it will say je, right? I in French, okay? And then you take that word that it output and you pass it back into the decoder network. So now you say beginning of, it got beginning of sentence, now it gets je, and it says suis, and you keep, so this is an autoregressive process where the output gets fed back into the input, and it continues generating text. Does that all make sense? I mean, this is a very simplified diagram, obviously, but this is actually, 2014 to 2016, this is kind of state-of-the-art ML for neural machine translation. Yeah, please.
So is beginning of sentence input there the internal terminal state of the encoder RNN at end of state?
No, it's separate. It's just like a different token that tells the decoder RNN to get started. Yeah, I don't actually know. To be honest, I don't have an intuition for why you need that, because as soon as the decoder gets input, it should know that that's the beginning of state. But I guess it has an input channel, so.
Okay, so the arrow between the blue and the white is the internal state of the
Yeah, or some
at the end.
exactly. Or some transformation of it or something like that. But it's kind of passing information through that channel. And then the first input, the only kind of input beforehand to give that decoder is that beginning of sentence. And it's going to generate the rest that you keep feeding back into it. Everybody good? OK. So this actually worked decently well compared to a lot of the machine learning methods that were kind of based on more statistical approaches in the past. This was super powerful. It was really kind of blowing away benchmarks. But RNNs have some limitations that made this approach pretty hard to scale. Okay? So let's talk about the limitations of recurrent neural networks. And these slides are painful for me because I love recurrent neural networks, but they're the truth, I think. Okay, so limitations of RNNs. So think about language modeling. A word's meaning depends on the context that word is in, right? A word's meaning is not divorced from the context. So here's a very simple example. I went fishing at the riverbank. Okay, the word bank there has a very specific meaning. You're imagining the side of a river. People at the bank were not happy when I robbed them. All right, now bank has a very different meaning, right? And you can't get that just from the word in isolation. You have to consider the context. And the context here is, well, if you rob a bank, well, it's probably not the river thing. It's probably a place where we store money. But think about what the network needs to do to understand that word bank. Okay, so remember, the network is processing words one at a time. It gets so if it was translating the sentence, it would get people at the bank. And so now it has this word bank, which has some ambiguity around it, for example. And then it gets were not happy when I robbed. So many words later is when you finally get the context that tells you what that bank was. I mean, this is a very simple example, but language has all sorts of these kind of dependencies, kind of short range, long range. I mean, think about the word happy. That word happy has a meaning. If you look at the word right before it, not happy has the exact opposite meaning. Right? And you can't, so the meaning of happy can't be considered in isolation. You have to consider not. So the point here is this sequence has all these dependencies across it. And the way the RNN is processing it, one token at a time, one word at a time, means that it has to kind of keep this internal memory, a hidden state that represents everything that it's seen before in case it needs to kind of modify that text appropriately. And that might be OK for a couple words, 10 words, 100 words. But if you really want to scale this out to long sequences, right, hundreds of words, thousands of words, this is a really challenging problem for RNNs, right? How do you maintain that kind of memory of what you've seen before and hold it some indefinite period into the future when you're going to need it again, right? So that's just kind of a practical problem of how RNNs are seeing the but then, this is a little bit kind of more machine learning related. I don't know if you guys got a chance to talk about backpropagation at all, a little bit, gradient descent. So the idea is, you do a computation, you do a computation, you do a computation, and at the end, your network produces some output, okay? And that's when you can tell whether your computation was right. So you compute a cost based on all your successive computations, right? So, and then you're going to try to go back and update the weights of your network based on that series of computations. So what does that mean? So that means, the RNN is doing a computation on I, and then it does the next one, M, et cetera, all the way through. And the very first output where you can get any sort of information on whether it's doing the right thing or doing the wrong thing isn't until here, until je, right? And then suis. But because we know what, in your training, you know what the actual answer was, je suis content. So that's when you have something to kind of compare to your output. So imagine that the sequence was 1,000 words long. You're doing 1,000 computations, and you have no idea if they were right or not until you get to that first output. And then you have to do what's called kind of back propagating your things related to your error or your loss all the way back. And the strength of that signal diminishes over time the further back you have to go. So the longer sequence you have, the weaker training signal you have for training your neural network. So this becomes a really hard problem at long sequence lengths. Okay, so that's more of a, yeah, please.
Dumb question. Where is it getting all of these words from? What's the data set? Is it dictionaries, or does it have access to the complete Google database of all instances of words in English and French?
Great.
When they appear together, when they don't, where is it grabbing these from?
Yeah, great question. So kind of, let's say in the 2010s, mid 2010s, there were a lot of these kind of compiled resources. So you'd have like, 2 million English sentences and French sentences, like the pairs, right? Or the same for German, or something like that. So you'd have kind of this manufactured data set, and that's what these would be trained on.
So you have a Berlitz book.
Sorry, I actually don't know what that.
It's where it doesn't define individual words. It just writes down a sentence in one language, and it gives you
Exactly.
the other language. And if you don't know how to speak the language, you can still translate it and transliterate it and say the sentence in the other language, and a native speaker will understand you.
Right.
But you don't understand anything about the semantic or syntactical rules to relate language A to language B.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And there's, of course, ambiguity in these transformations. Like, it's not a one-to-one mapping from one sentence to another, but you're kind of seeing these examples. The hope, with these big data approaches is, like, with enough examples, you start to actually get structure and not just kind of like a lookup table between one thing and another. So that was, when these approaches were popularized, they were kind of trained on those data sets. But of course now, ChatGPT, for example, they're crawling Wikipedia and getting, like, now just massive amounts of data. They can crawl the entire internet. Google has, pretty substantial data. So the data set sizes have scaled pretty substantially as well since these approaches. And then, of course, these problems are related, right? So if you're limited in your ability to handle long sequences, that's going to limit the types of data you can apply these things to. But if you can break away from this problem, you can enable kind of applications to really just, diverse, very large, massive data sets. All make sense? Okay, so this is kind of a machine learning sort of computational issue that it's hard to back propagate error all the way through this path when you have a deep network like this. And so just one more practical problem. I don't know if folks here know much about kind of computation, but this is pretty basic. So the RNN, it takes in an input, and you can't do that next computation. So it takes in the input I, and it has some internal state. Then the next computation it has to do is taking in the input M and update its internal state. It can't do that second computation until you've done the first one. It can't do the third computation until you've done the second one, right? So there's a serial dependency. You have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, like that in sequence. So that's going to limit just how fast you can run this, which, computers are fast. So maybe for a sequence of 100, that's not a big deal. For a sequence of 1,000, that starts to become a big deal. when you need to do that, a billion times, which is probably, on the scale of kind of how these, well, way more than that actually, how these networks are trained, then that, that difference makes a big deal. So because it just takes time, RNNs are slow to train. Now, if you know anything about computer architecture, things like CPUs or GPUs or these new tensor processing units, the thing they've really done is just parallelize everything. So take very simple computations, just be able to do a bunch of linear algebra in parallel. With a serial computation, you can't adapt it to a parallel architecture very well, right? If you have these dependencies, then there's nothing you can do with all that other compute power. If you can parallelize this computation, you can start training on massive data sets in parallel. So this is just kind of a practical training problem. You can train, if you could get rid of the serial dependency, you could train these networks much faster. Okay, all makes sense? Yeah, please.
What's the limitation in training these things kind of one chunk of text at a time? Yeah, I understand you can't do it at the word level, but at some point, it seems like you can hit some kind of length limit that context isn't bleeding over in maybe a particularly insidious way. Just thinking, like, is it possible to break this up so the gradient descent is working over the order of a sentence or two?
Yeah, there's some kind of trivially parallelizable operations here. So, example, we talked about the data set, right? So it's a bunch of English to French word pairs, right? So you could do two of those in parallel. You don't necessarily, like, the first word pair has nothing to do with the second one, so you can compute your on that. But I think each individual example, they're just strict dependencies there. And so when you train these things, you think about like an epoch is training through your entire data set. You're going to keep doing that over and over again. So that limits kind of like your epoch time, if that makes sense. Okay. All right, okay, so issues. Now, transformers, 2017. Transformers bypass all three of these issues of recurrent neural networks, and that's made them kind of super powerful. And really has kind of changed the game here. So the key difference is that transformers process all elements of a sequence together. Okay, so they avoid this sequential computation. There's no waiting on the output of the previous computation in order to proceed. You can just do everything all the time. So what does that mean? In the network, there's no need to maintain a large memory of what's happened before in the sequence because you've got access to the entire sequence all the time. Okay? There's no need to backpropagate through a long pathway, right? So there's no vanishing gradient issue anymore. And you can trivially parallelize the computation, which results in really, really fast training. So you can just run through iterations of your data set over and over again very quickly. Okay, so compared to RNNs, transformers are very well suited for long sequences, for training with massive data sets, and for using massive compute. And that's what's happened in the last couple of years, is that we've switched to long sequences, massive data sets, crawling the entire internet, and just using massive compute. Google has farms of TPUs, and each one of these models that you hear about is trained for potentially many weeks on basically supercomputer power. Right? I think it's kind of changed what we consider to be a supercomputer these days. The class of computation we have right now is just unbelievable. All right, okay, so hopefully you guys have some sense for machine learning models that have been useful for sequence data. Now let's jump into a kind of a high-level overview of the transformer architecture itself. And again, please, jump in if you have questions. Okay, so the transformer architecture was introduced in this paper, Vaswani et al., NeurIPS 2017, with the title "Attention is All You Need." So you've probably heard of some machine learning papers with like X is all you need. This is where that trend comes from this like catchy title, "Attention is all you need." And that should give you a clue as to like what the key thing they they did here was break away from the RNN and focus just on this thing called attention, which I'll go into. But I wanted to point out two quick things about this paper that I didn't know before I was preparing this talk. So one, the paper now has 82,000 citations. So 82,000 people have cited this paper as Vaswani et al.
Is this just like ChatGPT or something?
Citing itself. That's potentially, yeah, probably.
Google saying this.
Yeah, fair. I don't have an independent assessment, you're right. Facebook probably has it as like 100 citations or something. Okay, so that's cool, Vaswani et al., 82,000 citations. Then there's this footnote on the first page. Every single one of these authors is starred, equal contribution. Listing order is random. This has 82,000 citations with a randomized listing order. So Vaswani, his name is fairly popular based on a little random number generator. But I thought that was really cool that they just upfront acknowledged that this is a huge team effort and didn't feel like any one person contributed any more than the others. I've never seen a paper where every author was equal and they randomized order. That's pretty cool. Okay, so the transformer architecture. There's a lot on this schematic. Don't worry, we're going to break it down. I'm going to break it down a little bit. Domeick's tutorial breaks it down even further. You don't need to know everything anyway, but you're going to see it over and over again. It's interesting. There have been a lot of papers that come after this, and they use basically the exact same architecture or like pieces of this exact architecture, so much so that if you look at their methods sections, they say, oh, just look at that paper. They don't even write out details. They just say, we use X from the Vaswani paper. It's pretty interesting. Okay, so transformer architecture. So remember that the key advantage of the transformers process all elements of a sequence together. Okay, so we want to avoid any sort of sequential computations. So let's dive in and try to understand this architecture a little bit. Okay, so I'm gonna flip it on its side. Same thing you just saw, rotated. Okay, so there are two pieces here to the transformer. Just like before, we have an encoder. And that encoder is going to take in a sequence of words. And it's going to output what we call embeddings, or representations is another word. And the idea is to not just represent the word anymore, but to take context into account. Remember we were talking about the structure of language and how the meaning of a word changes depending on the context around it. So the idea is, you have a sequence of some length, with it's just the words. And then the output of this encoder is going to be the same length, but each of those words is going to be kind of augmented by the context of the entire sequence. Okay. And now the decoder, just like before, the decoder is going to take input from the encoder. And so it takes in those kind of contextualized embeddings, right? The context, the words augmented by context. And then it's going to output probabilities for the next words in a sequence. Okay? So this is kind of a classic problem in language modeling, is just next word prediction. That's what the decoder's goal is, just to say, okay, given this sequence, what is the next most likely word? Okay, so what does this look like? Again, take the previous example. I am happy to je suis content. So encoder input, first is the word I. Okay, so I've been using words, but of course, when we pass something into a neural network, it needs to be numbers. So each of these words has an embedding. Okay, so all that is some vector of numbers that represents that specific word. So for every word in the vocabulary, there's some sequence of numbers that represents that word. Okay, this is kind of a long-standing challenge in natural language processing. Is like kind of how do you create these embeddings for words? There's so many different ways to do it. So I'm just kind of skipping over that problem. Also, if there are any aficionados here, you know that it's not actually word embeddings, but there's slightly more nuance to that. They're called byte pair encodings. So you could have like fish-ing and then the ing would be like an embedding that's meant to, because it's kind of its own meaning. Anyway, but just forget I said that and imagine that every word has an embedding. Okay? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, sure.
I do remember seeing a image in a paper where they were talking about these kinds of non-trivial embeddings.
Right.
How dependent the input features matter a lot for just about anything. How critical is that embedding to this kind of architecture working? Like if I just gave it a one-to-one word to number mapping, I could see that
Yeah.
problems and whatnot, but like how much work goes into that embedding?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about this with respect to like neural data and whatnot, where it's like, okay, what are the features?
Right.
What can I do beforehand that would maybe transform my input features into something that is suitable to this? Do you have a sense of what the criticality of that?
Sure. Yeah. It's a fantastic question. I'm not an expert on embeddings, but so there are different approaches here. There are kind of some off-the-shelf embeddings that have been used for a long time. A popular one is like word2vec is kind of an older one that you give it a word, it'll spit out a vector. Nothing to do with the rest of the neural network, but it's just a known embedding that a lot of people have used in a lot of problems. One thing you can do, related to your question, is not actually assume any embedding. Okay, so instead of having like I be, so these vectors, for example, just to give you some context here, this might be like 512 numbers. Okay, so I maps to a number that's 512 long. Okay, another approach would be using, I guess, they're one-hot embedding, if folks are familiar with that. So let's imagine your language has 70,000 words in it, and that's probably a small vocabulary these days, I guess. You would have a vector that's 70,000 long, and there's only, all elements are 0 except for 1. Okay, so that would be a one-hot embedding. So there's one specific number there that corresponds to I, and that's 1, and everything else is 0. So that's a really long vector, obviously, right? 70,000. And then what you can do is have that be the input to your neural network and train a mapping from that to something learned by the network so it finds its own embedding, like a linear transformation. Let's say, so maybe it's still 512 dimensions, but you're mapping from like 70,000 to 512, like just a big matrix multiplication. And that the weights of that matrix can be learned by the network. So that's kind of the agnostic, just like, oh, okay, let the network take care of it. And like everything else in machine learning, letting the networks take care of it typically wins. So I think that's probably better, general performance if you can spare the compute. Make sense? Yeah. Okay, cool. So yeah, but for ignore the problem of finding embeddings for now and just assume. But you're absolutely right. That was one of the challenges when we started applying this to neural data. We're not talking about words anymore. What are the right embeddings? I think for us, it was actually much simpler than taking on this problem. We tried a couple approaches, but it turned out the simplest thing was good enough. So, okay, so I am happy. You're going to have a maximum sequence length here, right? You don't want the input to kind of change. So it could be, let's say, 10 words long or 4 words long or whatever, and then you just fill the rest with null, right? So your sentence ends at I am happy, and then the rest of your words are null. Make sense? So then this is your input. So remember, it was like 512, let's say, by however long your sequence is. So let's pretend it's 10. Okay, so it's a matrix that's 512 wide and 10 long. Okay, so that's going to come into your encoder network, and then the encoder is going to, at the end of the encoding, its output should be the exact same dimensionality. So, it's going to have as many outputs as your sequence length, and their vector size will be the same as your vector size at the input, right? But now those embeddings should include context, right? It's not just a one-to-one mapping from words to the embeddings, but now it's kind of taking the information around the words to include that. Please.
I feel like in different languages, if you want to express the same meaning, the sequence length doesn't have to be the same.
Yeah, I think you just kind of want a big sequence length, like as big as you can, and then you just kind of fill it up with with null. But I actually don't know what happens for languages that have like a lot of variety in how the words are represented. You know, characters could be, one character could represent a lot of what we would consider many words or something like that. So yeah, I don't know much about how you apply this to different languages. But the big thing is, like, I mean, I think you want a sequence length that's as long as you can, so that you can fit kind of your data. But of course, the longer your sequence length, the more weights you're going to have to learn for your neural network, just the more you have to train. So that's kind of the balance that's being played here. Okay. Okay, great. So that's the output of the encoder, right? And so now we're going to generate the French text with that encoder, right? So the first thing that, with the decoder. So the encoder has all that output, and then the decoder sees all of that, and then will output. Now, this is actually, we're talking about one-hot encodings. So that's how the output of the decoder is structured, where it's, if you have 70,000 words, it is a 70,000 length vector, which I've only highlighted one, so like maybe that's je, and that's like the thing that the decoder says is this word, but it's actually a probability distribution. So it could, be saying like je is the most likely, but maybe there's some other words that are also likely in this position. Okay. And then when you're actually running this network, you take and you pass that back into the decoder. So this is after you've trained the network is the way it's run. So now the decoder is seeing everything output by the encoder and its previous output, je, right? And then it generates another output, suis. Pass that back in, generate another output, content. Pass content in, and then the network actually outputs EOS, end of sentence, meaning there's you don't need to keep doing this. We're done, right? So you'll notice that this part is sequential. This is an autoregressive process. I'm not going to talk about it, but they don't actually do that when they're training the networks. They only do it when they're running the networks. Okay, so this sequential computation we just talked about, they have a cool trick to bypass that, and it happens in this thing called masked multi-headed attention, but I'm not going to go into detail on that right now. Okay, so yeah, so the decoder is taking in the embeddings produced by the encoder network, and then it makes the prediction, what is the next word? And then it takes in, an embedding of that word and makes the next prediction. What is the next word, et cetera.
Inputs and outputs are still coming in one word at a time.
Only when you're running the network.
Right.
Yeah. So when you're training the network, the decoder actually still has access to everything, but they have this special masking so that when it's predicting the first word, it doesn't have access to the future. And when it's predicting the second word, it doesn't have access to, it has access to the previous word, but not the future, if that makes sense. Well, not of its own computation, of what should be there, right? So you have an answer when you're training. You know that the answer should be je suis content. So if you're trying to predict suis, you can see je, but you can't see content.
I guess my question is, where it says input embedding, does it have one input arrow for a word, or does it in fact have 10 input arrows for a word?
You're saying up here for the encoder?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, it's seeing all the words simultaneously.
Okay.
So that would be, let's say you had 10 words, and it's 512 wide vector, then that input would be 10 by 512. Yeah. Yeah, and same for the decoder, that it has a wide input there as well. Okay, any questions? Okay, so the key advance here is that during this process, let's say during the encoding process, the encoder sees all of its inputs simultaneously. It doesn't have to have a memory of what has been fed in before. It doesn't need to do this sequential computation. It just takes everything into account and then spits out kind of what it thinks the embedding should be. And similarly, like the decoder, it takes all the input from the encoder along with any input that you're feeding in, to the decoder simultaneously and just predicts the next word. So there's no sequential computation when you're training these networks, which is a really, really big deal when it comes to training, when it comes to vanishing gradients, et cetera. Okay. So just to kind of summarize where we are. So transformer architecture, you have the encoder, which takes in a sequence of words, and then outputs embeddings, or sometimes called representations, that can take context into account. Okay. And then the decoder takes in the kind of contextualized embeddings from the encoder and outputs probabilities for next words in a sequence. And this is a common problem in language modeling. Give me a sequence, what's the next most likely word? Okay. So this was the architecture from the Vaswani paper. And as I mentioned, like people have kind of taken this and run with it. And it's so effective that some people have only taken the encoder half. And so, encoder only, there's a very, there are a couple models that are just the encoder. One really famous one is called BERT, pre-training of bidirectional transformers for language understanding. And this is from Google. So that just gets rid of the decoder piece and only trains an encoder. And actually, the exercise that you guys will be doing today takes a model that's very similar to BERT. It's just the encoder piece, no decoder. Okay.
Seems like a missed opportunity for a paper title, encoders is all we need.
Yeah, that's true. But by going with BERT, they then spawned a whole bunch of other names, like play on words. So then there's a Bart, Bart Simpson. There's an Elmo model.
Planted their own tree.
Exactly. Okay. So, oh yeah, please. Does it have multi-headed attention? Is that what you're asking? I think it does, yeah? I might be misremembering. I thought BERT had multi-headed. Do you know? It does? Okay. Yeah, sorry, I didn't even tell you guys about multi-headed attention yet. But we'll get to actual attention in later. All right. Okay, so BERT, one model, only the encoder. Decoder-only models. Hopefully some of you are familiar with this thing called GPT. Yeah, so that's an entirely different series of papers. GPT-1, I think that was 2019. They're basically just taking the decoder half of this and doing the next word prediction. So I actually don't know what they did for embeddings for the input to GPT. I don't know if you know that. I'm not really sure. But yeah, they just got rid of the encoder pathway, and they were training, instead of doing, let's say, pairs of sentences, they're doing just take a bunch of text, put in n-1 words, predict n, right? And that's the way original GPT is trained. Okay, so yeah, hopefully you guys can see this paper really kind of changed the landscape pretty dramatically, and we're seeing the effects of that. So I thought it'd be cool to just do kind of like a live demo, just to make this a little bit more concrete. And they say never do live demos, so this is obviously going to be a mistake, but we'll try anyway. Let's see if I can. Okay, there's this really great website called Hugging Face, which if you guys ever get into machine learning research, and especially transformer research, they have a lot of open source implementations of different models. They have kind of environments where you're able to test out models live. It's pretty cool, you don't have to code anything. So this is just an example. This is a model called Distill GPT-2, where they took kind of the GPT-2 model, and they don't actually, I don't think they had the weights for GPT-2, but they used it to train a new model, which is, they took the smallest GPT-2. Every one of these networks has different variants, the larger ones always being more powerful. So they took the smallest one of GPT-2 and then trained it to do, trained another network from it. And so let's just do an example of that. So, GPT-2, not the greatest model in the world. I mean, pretty impressive for back in the day, but not the greatest. So let's say we put in the California Institute of Technology is located, and all this network is going to be doing is next word prediction, right? So it's going to take what I give it, predict the next word, take that, predict the next word, take that, predict the next word, right? So do compute here. So Hugging Face, really cool. It's just running everything. Like, I'm not doing anything on my laptop right now, really. So it's loading the model. OK. Oh, that's pretty good. That's not bad, actually. The other times I've tried it, it's told me you were located in San Diego. It once said that it was located in France, which I thought was very weird since I say California in the prompt. I tried Caltech, and the answers were just all over the place. But anyway, so this is actually not bad. But it's also, there's some sampling going on, so it's a stochastic process, meaning I think I could hit compute and just get a different answer. Let's try it. I think it's already got the model loaded, so this should be faster. Ah, Berkeley. OK, that's that might be a little controversial, GPT-2.
Development of technology.
Try Caltech.
All right, let's give it a shot.
This is a great story generator.
No, all lowercase.
Sorry.
Capital C, lowercase.
OK. Caltech is located in, I'm sorry,
Caltrash.
Oakland County, California, right? So I mean, but you see what's happening here. It's not that, this model doesn't actually have a large understanding, or if models have any understanding, that's obviously not a great word. But it's just saying, all right, take the previous words. What's something that's likely to come next? And it's not going to get it exactly right. But when you read the sentence, it almost sounds like, reasonable text if you kind of ignore the content.
I am located in.
Ah. Are we trying to figure out if the model has has a sense of self? The eastern section of a village.
That's poetic.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so if you need some writing prompts, I think this is pretty good.
I just put into my app, where is Caltech? Spelled capital C, lowercase A-L-T-E-C-H. It says Caltech, short for the California Institute of Technology, is located in Pasadena, California, United States.
So they've gotten a little bit better. This was GPT-2, which I guess 2021 maybe? I'm not sure.
This is GPT-4. Oh.
Yeah, they've orders of magnitude more weights, orders of magnitude more data, but a lot of the fundamentals are the same. Well, I don't think they're as public with what's going on with GPT anymore, but it's the same concepts, let's say. Yeah. OK, all makes sense? Any other quick prompts? All right. I just have to get back to my
So somebody put some time and effort into this. What was the point
of.
distill GPT? What was the intended goal?
Yeah, so I think my guess, this isn't my space necessarily, but there's a lot of a lot of these large language models. The only people that can train them are OpenAI, Google, Facebook, or sorry, Meta. Those people that just have access to crazy data and crazy compute. So the open source community can't really compete with that. You've got a cluster. Even if you have like a cluster of GPUs, it'll take you millennia to train like one of these models, right? So I think the idea here is ways for the kind of research and open source community to be able to continue to advance these models. Maybe you can't train kind of like the state-of-the-art thing, but you can use an architecture that's close to it and figure out if you can tweak things and things like that. Actually, there's been an explosion in open source in the last few months. So Meta released this model called Llama, which they actually, I think initially didn't release the weights. They just released kind of the architecture, right? So to use the model, you'd need the weights. But I think the weights were available to the research community, and somehow the weights kind of got available to everybody. I think through, so there's some link you can just go download the weights right now. And so the open source community has like taken that and done some really impressive things, like advances in these models, like lowering the amount of compute you need, People are able to kind of fine-tune these models on like a laptop instead of the TPU scale compute. So it's actually, I think by necessity, it's like driving a lot of innovation in the open source community now, just because one model kind of got kicked over the fence. So it's a really interesting time. And I'm sure like people at Meta are watching that and saying like, oh, how can we use these advances to update our models and make them train faster and everything like that. It's pretty cool. All right. OK, so here we are. We talked about the transformer architecture at a high level. I didn't give you any details of what's going on under the hood. We'll get into that a little bit later, and you'll definitely dive into it in the notebook and be able to code up your own. So hopefully that'll be fun. But we'll just talk about kind of an application of transformers to neuroscience really quick. And again, I'm not an imaging person. I'm sure everybody in this room has more imaging experience than me, so I'm sorry if I sound like an idiot. But I thought this was a really, really cool paper. So we'll see how it goes. Neural encoding of language. So some of you might be familiar with this work from Alex Huth's lab at University of Texas, Austin. And the challenge that their team is taking on is, can one decode continuous speech non-invasively? So through fMRI. Can we actually kind of decode speech through fMRI? And their strategy here is to build a very simple, take subjects, they're sitting in the scanner, bold response is being measured using fMRI, and they're listening to naturally spoken word. Okay, so just kind of natural language, long, like many hours. So I think participating in one of these experiments means you're sitting in a scanner for many hours. Okay, so they record activity. They want to build a simple model, an encoding model that takes words and relates it to the voxels, right? And then they want to use a language model to estimate probabilities of word combinations, and then decode sentences. So encoding in this case is mapping words to actual bold responses. Decoding is taking bold responses and trying to figure out what word was spoken. And they're using a language model to kind of power this process. Okay, so I'll break it down a little bit. I'll just mention Alex gave a really recent talk that's on YouTube. I'd just recommend it's like an hour or something, but it's really, really good if this is all interesting to you. OK, so the encoding process. This isn't exactly what they used, but it's based on this paper from Alex Huth when he was in Jack Gallant's lab, this Nature paper from 2016, which is voxel-wise modeling of semantic features. Okay, so the basic idea here is, and here's where I'm going to start sounding like a complete idiot. I apologize. So the subjects are in the scanner, and they're just listening, right? The thing they're listening to is, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Moth Radio Hour. It's just a radio program where people are, it's these really engaging stories. So maybe it's not that bad to sit in the scanner and get to listen to the moth for a few hours, but it's pretty cool if you've never heard it. So just like spoken word, people telling stories that's recorded, that's like a podcast, and they're just listening to that in the scanner. Okay. And so they process the audio data to be able to pull out the words, right? And then we talked about word embeddings, right? A way of turning words into numbers. So they developed their own word embedding. So each of these words, I think in this case, so each word is projected to a 985-dimensional word embedding. Okay? So a little bit larger than what I was saying before. And they computed this themselves. I think it says using word co-occurrence statistics. I don't exactly know how they did it. But key point being, so now they have a word embedding so that at any point in time, they have a representation of what word was being spoken right then. Okay? And of course, they simultaneously have the bold responses. And they're going to just do a very simple model on a voxel by voxel basis to take the word embeddings and just do a linear mapping onto the voxels. Okay, so if you have 985 dimensional space, then for each voxel, you're learning 985 numbers. There's weighting your input to predict the voxel's response. And I think there's something to account for kind of the time course of bold activity. This is where I really don't understand imaging that well. Apologies. But it's a very simple kind of linear prediction model. So the thing they get out are these regression weights that map from the word embeddings to the voxels. And then they're just talking about the cross-validation procedure here. So for the same subjects, they take stories that were not used to train the models, present those stories to the subject, and then predict responses to that story. So this is kind of held out data that they use to validate their regression model. Okay, so very quick, first slide here is, I guess this is a flat map. A lot of people probably understand these better than I do. It's a way of kind of representing cortex in a 2D plane. Dark gray and light gray, I guess, are gyri and sulci. That's about as much as I know here. But the key point here, each point on the flat map, they're showing different voxels, and all they're saying is like, what are the areas we can even predict responses of? So can we get a significant prediction of response? So like, what's the p-value here that we're actually able to predict the measured bold response using this very simple linear model, word embeddings mapping onto bold response? All make sense? Okay, so that's just like kind of validating that their model is giving you significant predictions. Then they have some cool visualizations in the paper for what's kind of the semantic, what semantics, what's like the semantic map? So take each of these voxels, what does it care about, okay? So let's just break this down a little bit. Remember that word embedding space, like 985 dimensional? They just did dimensionality reduction on that. Have you guys talked about principal components analysis? Okay, so they took 985 dimensions, reduced it to 4 with PCA, or maybe 3 or 4, okay? 3 or 4 dimensions with PCA. And then, they kind of searched that space to just came up with words that represent different locations in that space, right? So, and those words are colored here. So, if you're on the PC1, PC2 axis, they found that words in that area are like visual or tactile, okay? And then if you look down here at the PC2, like down on PC2, you see social, emotional, mental. It's just, when they looked in the space, what are the words that kind of tended to be there? This is probably a bit of a subjective process. I don't know exactly how they did this mapping. But, and then, so that's the color code. And then they said, okay, if you look at all these different regions of cortex that had, I think, that we were predicting, what did they most care about? Does that all make sense? So now they're saying, they've got a model that says, right now, map this word onto a voxel. And from that, they're saying, okay, what types of semantics most influence a given voxel? I mentioned that Alex gave a talk on this. I actually pulled a video from that talk because one thing he was showing is that this is consistent across subjects. So he's showing kind of the semantic maps for the three different subjects here, and it just kind of rotates them. I mean, visually, you can just see that there's consistency in the semantics, like just the coloring for each of these subjects. Excuse me. Okay, sorry. So, yeah, go ahead.
It's kind of, I haven't seen this before, but it's striking to me that people are listening to stuff in this, like they're not reading.
That's right.
But you see like visual cortex and all these visual areas lighting up and mapping onto specific word categories. That which always made me think like, what?
It's
Is that a machine or is it magic in the brain here?
right.
How that is.
It's a little wild to me. Yeah. Like all they're doing is sitting there kind of listening. I'm sure that sparks an internal cognitive process, but this distributed representation is pretty amazing. Yeah.
Actually, they have papers, reading and listening. Actually, it's almost the same
Oh, cool. Yeah. You said reading, so like speaking it out loud and listening. Yeah.
Reading the script.
Right. That's,
Saying the word by word on the screen.
yeah.
It's the same as listening to the
Cool. That's really impressive. Yeah. Okay. So remember, this is the encoding model. So they're trying to predict the bold responses from the words. Okay. So you got a sequence of words. You just do this very simple linear mapping, matrix multiplication, and then you're predicting the bold responses. So I'm actually shocked that such a simple thing, works. It's like learn a matrix that goes from your word embeddings to the bold responses, and it's predictive, kind of across subjects. They have some really cool follow-up papers from Alex's lab where they actually, instead of using kind of the word embedding that they created, they use the word embedding from like a GPT model. Right, remember those models have those representations, so they use some of the middle layer representations there and find that they significantly outperform kind of even these simple mappings. So there's even more like contextual information. Like, remember, these are just word embeddings, so there's no context taken into account here. When you add context from like a language model like GPT, they can do pretty substantially better on predictions. So I think in the paper I'm about to show you, they actually, I don't think they use the exact same encoding model, but the concept is very similar. It's a very simple, take your word embeddings, linear mapping onto bold responses. All right, so then, now remember the challenge is, okay, can we just take the bold activity and figure out what it is the person was speaking or listening to, et cetera, okay, right? So remember, the encoding model, folks in here a little comfortable with probability and statistics? So if I say P of R given S, hopefully that means the probability of a response, the bold response, given the stimulus that was presented, right? So that's what's being captured by their very simple encoding model. Okay. And so, but their goal is to decode. So actually what they want is, given a response, can I figure out which stimulus was presented? So what they actually want to do is kind of compute a probability across stimuli and then pick the one that is most likely, right? So, all words or a combination of words, what is the most likely one given kind of the response? But it turns out there's a challenge in computing that directly. I can't go into the details, but it's just that you have to compute something called P of R, the response distribution, and that's very, very hard for this type of like high-dimensional data with limited data sets. So they're not going to do that. But they use an approach from Jack Gallant's lab. I think 2011 was when they first started doing this, where, through Bayes' rule, one thing we know is that P of S given R, the probability of a given stimulus, the probability of a stimulus given a response is proportional to, that should be P of R given S times P of S, okay? I apologize for the typo, but P of R given S times P of S, and P of R given S, we have it above. That's just the encoding model that we just talked about, like that very simple linear mapping, okay? And then P of S, they can get from a language model. So the language model can tell you, remember what that decoder is doing. If I have a sequence of words, what's the probability of the next word, right? So it's actually figuring out kind of probabilities of sequences, okay? So they're going to use language models to fill in this missing piece of it's essentially the structure of natural language. There's a really cool paper that just came out in March. Tang et al. From Alex's lab. Semantic reconstruction of continuous language from non-invasive brain recording, where they're trying out exactly what we just said. How can we decode responses? So very similar setup. You've already kind of seen the thing on the left here, which is the encoding model. They take recordings, they have a word embedding, they learn a mapping onto bold response, like a voxel-wise mapping, okay? So that's all exactly what we talked about before with maybe some different word embeddings. But then the key thing they're adding here is the language model. So what they do is, kind of given a sequence of words like I saw a dog, so you have candidate words or candidate sequences like I saw a dog. The language model is going to give you the probability of the next word. I saw a dog with is one probable outcome there. I saw a dog and is another probable outcome. Or maybe a different candidate that you previously computed was I saw a big. And then the language model is going to say, OK, what's the likely next word? OK. And so that's where you get P of S from. And then in each step in this process, they have a certain number of candidates. They compute the continuations. And then they discard like the least likely continuations. And those become the most likely ones become kind of the candidates for the next step. So this is kind of an iterative process where they're just decoding word by word. OK. I think if you want to talk about the details, it'd probably, we could sit down, but it's actually pretty straightforward. Like they're kind of just using the language model to compute like what's the most likely next word. So how well does it work, right? So actual stimulus, the thing on the left. I got up from the air mattress and pressed my face against the glass of the bedroom window, expecting to see eyes staring back at me, but instead finding only darkness. So what they're coloring here are, the thing on the right is the decoded stimulus, and they're coloring, light blue is where the decoding got the exact word somewhere. Purple is kind of where the decoding got the gist of the word, and red is like just a kind of a clear error. So like, for example, I got up, decoded. I just continued to walk up. So the decoder doesn't know exactly what's going on, but got up and walk up. There's like clearly kind of that rising phenomenon. Walk up to the window. Window was also used in the text they were listening to open the glass against the glass. You see that there as well. So again, it's not getting things exactly right, but it's actually capturing some amount of the meaning of what's being said here. I think this is impressive. This is bold responses on a single trial. I mean, think about the frequency of bold and like the time course of bold activation. All these signals are really slow, and it's a spoken word that they're trying to like decode. So other examples. I didn't know whether to scream, cry, or run away. The decoder started to scream and cry. So there's something in those bold responses that was pretty reliable for scream and cry. Leave me alone. She just said, I told you to leave me alone, and you can't hurt me anymore. I don't need your help. So you can see there's a lot of, I'm sorry, that part was actually wrong. But I thought this one was particularly interesting. I don't have my driver's license yet, and I just jumped out right when I needed to. And she says, well, why don't you come back to my house? She is not ready. She has not even started to learn to drive. So that's a different sequence of text, but it has the same idea. I don't have my driver's license yet. She has not even started to learn to drive. So the language model combined with bold is able to capture like some amount of meaning in these sentences. Okay, I'll just a couple other like really cool things. I mean, one, this is validation. You can look at the paper, but this is above chance on certain kind of similarity scores for text. Multiple individual subjects, they show above chance decoding. So this is pretty interesting. It may be related to what you were saying earlier about remember this is like spoken word that they were listening to. They trained the models on spoken word. But what they wanted to ask was, if the subject is what we'd call kind of covertly rehearsing something, can they decode it using the same model, right? So instead of listening to spoken word, first they get the subject to kind of just practice saying a phrase, a series of texts. I'm probably not going to get this exactly right, but they kind of practice the phrase to get timing right, and then they ask the subject to kind of say it in their head without actually saying it out loud, and then just ask how well the model does. And you can kind of look at this, and if you go through it, you can see, given kind of the space of language, the fact that these things are similar when the subject is not listening to anything, they're just covertly speaking, is to me kind of pretty astonishing. So you see building, over a stream. There's the concept of bridge, walk across a bridge. There's some similarity here, even when the subject's not listening and not speaking. It's pretty cool. And then another thing that is also pretty wild is they also just showed the subjects videos and asked them to like watch the videos and use the same language model. So now it's so that's covert speech. Now it's visual input from a model that was trained on audio, and you can kind of see the stimulus. Actually, he has a video of this, so I'll just it's in the supplement of the paper. So this is the video. So remember, the model's been trained on audio. They show the subject a video, and then they ask their model to decode. So the decoder prediction, you'll see there's a lot of stuff that's not going to be right. I think it starts to become a little bit eerie. So Ran, you could see kind of, she ran. It starts to become eerie when she starts interacting with this thing, like screaming. Tried to kiss her. There's like interaction with the mouth. See their hand against her stomach. Gasp for air. You could kind of see the dragon kind of gasp. She's very weak. I held her, holding the dragon, breathing under control. First shot of her blood, you could see the dragon was kind of bloody. Clean up. Okay, anyway, key point here, I mean, to me, this is wild. You can have somebody sit in a scanner, train a model based on, responses to audio, and actually have some cross-validated prediction on video. It's pretty amazing. All right. I think maybe we'll take a quick 5-minute break. Then we'll jump back into some ML. I'll tell you a little bit about model architectures, and then you guys can start diving in to the code notebook and start breaking stuff. Yeah? All right, cool.